At 0100 hours on November 15, 1942, radar operators in the Combat Information Center of the battleship USS Washington watched green traces sweep across their SG radar screens. 8,400 yards away, invisible in the total darkness of Iron Bottom Sound, a Japanese battleship was steaming directly toward them. The battleship was Kirishima, 14-inch guns, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Midway. Her captain, Sanji Iwabuchi, commanded 1,400 men and believed his ship was hunting cruisers. He had no idea a 16-inch gun battleship was tracking his every move on glowing radar screens. The radar operators had been tracking contacts for over an hour. They knew the SG system inside and out. Surface search radar, 10-centimeter wavelength, effective range to capital ships approximately 28,000 yards. The plan position indicator showed contacts as bright blips on a circular display. Range, bearing, movement, all visible at a glance. But the SG had one critical limitation. It could only see what it could see. It could not tell you what the target was: cruiser, battleship, destroyer. The radar did not know. Only the size of the return signal gave clues. The green blip at 8,400 yards was massive, too big for a cruiser. The operators had been tracking it as it moved southeast at 20 knots, then turned northwest, heading straight for Washington. They called out the range and bearing to the fire control director continuously. Their voices stayed level. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Japanese guns were training out. The question was, who would fire first? What happened in the next 7 minutes would prove that the eras of blind night fighting was over. The worst defeat in United States Navy history had occurred 3 months earlier, the Battle of Savo Island, August 9, 1942. USS Vincennes was part of the Northern Screening Force off Guadalcanal. She was patrolling between Savo Island and Florida Island, protecting the transport anchorage. The night was dark, overcast, occasional rain. Visibility about 10,000 yards in clear patches, less in the mist. Vincennes had radar. The CXAM air search set, 1.5-meter wavelength, good for detecting aircraft, not designed for surface work. The return signals from ships were weak, unreliable. The operators could see something on the scope sometimes, but identifying what they saw was nearly impossible. At 0155, Japanese searchlights snapped on. 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's strike force, had penetrated the screening line undetected. The searchlights illuminated Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy. 3 American heavy cruisers caught in perfect firing positions. Captain Frederick Reef Cole, commanding Vincennes, hesitated. The searchlights might be friendly. American ships used searchlights too. He waited to confirm the target before opening fire. That 5-second delay cost him his ship. Japanese 8-inch armor-piercing shells slammed into Vincennes at 5,500 yards. The 4th salvo hit. Fire control spaces destroyed. Turrets disabled. Shells penetrated the hull below the waterline. Flooding began immediately. 74 hits total. 3 torpedoes. Vincennes rolled over and sank at 0250, 95 minutes after the searchlights came on. 322 men died. The survivors said the same thing. They never saw the enemy until the searchlights came on. By then, it was too late. The Japanese had closed to point-blank range in total darkness, achieved perfect firing positions, and massacred them before they could effectively respond. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The second ship was USS Quincy. She sank at 0238, 52 minutes after taking her first hit. 370 men died. Her captain, Samuel Moore, was killed on the bridge by shell fragments. Quincy fired back, scored 1 hit on the Japanese cruiser Chokai. 1 hit. The Japanese scored approximately 50 hits on Quincy, most at ranges under 5,000 yards. The third ship was USS Astoria. She fought through the night, damage control teams battling fires and flooding. At noon on August 9, 12 hours after the battle, she rolled over and sank. 219 men died. Her crew never gave up. They fought until the water closed over her deck. The 4th ship was the Australian heavy cruiser HMS Canberra. 2 torpedoes, over 28-inch shell hits in the first minutes of combat. Crippled, burning, dead in the water. The Americans had to scuttle her the next morning. 84 men died. 4 cruisers sunk in 30 minutes. Over 1,000 men dead. 1 American destroyer damaged. Total Japanese losses. 1 cruiser moderately damaged by a single 8-inch shell. The Battle of Savo Island was the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. The problem was not courage. American crews fought hard. Damage control parties battled fires through the night. Gun crews stayed at their stations even as their ships sank beneath them. Captain Moore of Quincy was found dead at his post, still gripping the bridge railing. These were not men who gave up. The problem was not training. American gunners were well drilled. Fire control systems were excellent. In daylight, American ships could engage effectively at 20,000 yards. The Mark 8 fire control radar could provide accurate ranging. When they could see the target, they could hit it. The problem was simple. At night, in the dark waters off Guadalcanal, American ships could not see Japanese ships until it was too late. The Japanese could. Japanese night optics were superior. Their lookouts trained intensively for night operations. Special optical devices, carefully calibrated, allowed them to pick out dark shapes against darker backgrounds. Their tactics were refined through years of practice. Close and fast, achieve optimal firing positions, illuminate with searchlights, open fire at close range with masked batteries. By the time the enemy realized they were under attack, half their ships were already burning. The Americans called the waters off Guadalcanal Iron Bottom Sound. By November 1942, 16 Allied warships lay on the bottom. Cruisers, destroyers, transports. Most sunk at night. Most never saw what killed them. The ocean floor was carpeted with wreckage. The Japanese owned the night. Rear Admiral Willis Lee knew this when he took command of Task Force 64 on November 14, 1942. His force consisted of 2 battleships, Washington and South Dakota, and 4 destroyers. His mission was to stop a Japanese bombardment force headed for Guadalcanal. Intelligence reported the enemy force included the battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Lee was outnumbered more than 2 to 1 in ships. His only advantages were armor, firepower, and radar. Lee was 54 years old, born May 11, 1888, in Natley, Kentucky. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1908. At age 19 in 1907, he achieved something no American has done before or since. He won both the United States National Rifle Championship and the United States National Pistol Championship in the same year, the only person in American history to accomplish that feat. In 1914, during the Veracruz campaign in Mexico, Lee demonstrated his marksmanship under fire. He deliberately drew fire from 3 enemy snipers, exposing their positions, then shot all 3 at long range. His commanding officers took notice. This was not just a marksman. This was someone who understood ballistics at a fundamental level. At the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, Belgium, Lee won 5 gold medals, 1 silver medal, and 1 bronze medal in team shooting events, 7 total Olympic medals. He tied with teammate Lloyd Spooner for the most medals won by any athlete at a single Olympics. That record stood for 60 years. Lee was the most decorated American athlete of the 1920 Games. But Lee never saw shooting as sport alone. He saw it as applied science. Ballistics was mathematics. Wind, gravity, barrel harmonics, projectile stability, all of it could be calculated, understood, mastered. He approached the 16-inch guns of a battleship the same way he approached a rifle. They were precision instruments. If you understood the science, you could hit what you aimed at. Lee spent the 1930s in the Navy Department working on fleet training and modernization. He pushed for better fire control systems. He advocated for new optical rangefinders. He studied every technical innovation that might improve gunnery accuracy. When radar was introduced in the late 1930s, Lee recognized immediately what it represented. This was not just another incremental improvement. This was revolutionary. Most officers in 1940 and 1941 viewed radar with suspicion. It was new, untested, poorly understood. The equipment was temperamental. Operators needed extensive training. The displays were difficult to interpret. Many senior officers believed radar would never replace the human eye in traditional optical rangefinding. They saw it as an auxiliary system at best. Lee disagreed. He studied the radar systems obsessively. He read every technical manual. He attended every demonstration. He talked to the engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory who were developing the equipment. He talked to the technicians installing it on ships. He talked to the operators learning to use it. He attended gunnery exercises where radar was tested. He analyzed the results. Lee came to a conclusion that put him ahead of almost every officer in the Navy. Radar was not auxiliary, it was primary. In the right conditions, radar ranging was more accurate than optical rangefinding. At night, in weather, through smoke, radar could see when human eyes could not. The service that mastered radar would dominate naval warfare. The service that did not would lose. Lee pushed his conclusions up the chain of command. Some officers listened, many did not. The skepticism remained. Radar was too new, too unreliable, too difficult to integrate with existing fire control systems. The Navy needed more testing, more evaluation, more time before committing to radar as a primary fire control method. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. The United States was at war. There was no more time for cautious evaluation. The fleet had to fight with what it had, and what it had included radar that most commanders still did not fully trust. Lee became Assistant Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, in early 1942. In this position, he had influence over how the Navy would integrate radar into combat operations. He pushed for standardization of equipment. He pushed for better training of operators. He pushed for tactical doctrine that would exploit radar's capabilities fully. Some of his recommendations were adopted. Many were not. The Navy was changing, but slowly. By August 1942, Lee was a Rear Admiral and was given command of Battleship Division 6 in the Pacific. His flagship was USS Washington. Finally, he had operational command. He could train his own crews. He could develop his own tactics. He could prove what radar could do. Lee drilled his radar crews constantly, not just operation of the equipment, integration with fire control, coordination with the Combat Information Center, communication between radar operators, fire control directors, and the bridge, track contacts, identify formation patterns, maintain continuous plotting. He drilled his gunnery crews on radar-directed fire. Use radar ranging, optical bearing if possible, but be prepared to shoot on radar information alone if necessary. Trust the instruments. The radar will show you where the enemy is. Put your shells where the radar says. Most officers in 1942 did not train this way. They used radar for detection and warning. They tracked contacts. They maintained situational awareness. But when it came time to shoot, they wanted optical confirmation. They wanted to see the target with their own eyes before committing to fire. Lee trained his crews to shoot based on radar data alone if necessary. That was the difference. Washington's SG radar was one of the first production units, developed by Raytheon under guidance from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory and Naval Research Laboratory. It used S-band microwave frequencies, 10-centimeter wavelength, much shorter than the earlier meter wavelength radars. The shorter wavelength provided better resolution and more accurate ranging. The SG used British magnetron technology brought to the United States by the Tizard mission in 1940. The cavity magnetron was a breakthrough in microwave generation. It allowed compact, high-power radar sets small enough to mount on ships. The British had developed it for their own air defense radars. They shared it with the United States as part of the wartime technological exchange between the two nations. The SG's critical innovation was the plan position indicator display. Earlier, radars showed contacts as vertical spikes on an A-scope. Range was indicated by the position of the spike along a horizontal baseline. Bearing required rotating the antenna and noting when the spike reached maximum height. It worked, but it was difficult to maintain a tactical picture of multiple contacts. The PPI changed everything. It displayed contacts on a circular scope with the ship at the center. Range appeared as distance from center. Bearing appeared as direction from center. Multiple contacts appeared as multiple blips. Their movement was visible in real time. An operator could see the entire battle developing on a single screen. It was intuitive, clear, easy to understand. The SG could detect a battleship at approximately 28,000 yards, a cruiser at 20,000 yards, a destroyer at 16,000 yards. Bearing accuracy was within 1 degree. Range accuracy was within 40 yards. Those specifications sound crude by modern standards. They were revolutionary in 1942. Washington received her SG radar in August 1942 during a refit at Pearl Harbor. Lee oversaw the installation personally. He wanted to understand how the equipment was integrated into the ship's systems. He wanted to know its capabilities and limitations. He wanted to meet the operators who would use it in combat. The SG antenna was mounted on a small platform forward of the main tower. This provided good forward coverage, but created a blind sector of approximately 80 degrees to the rear. Lee recognized this as a tactical limitation. Ships behind Washington could disappear from the radar scope if they entered the blind sector. He noted this. He trained his crews to be aware of it. He developed procedures to track ships in the blind sector using other methods. But the blind sector remained. There was no perfect solution. Lee drilled the radar crews for 2 months before Washington went back into combat. Track contacts, identify ships by size of return signal, maintain continuous plot, communicate clearly, trust the equipment, trust each other. By November 1942, Washington's radar operators could read their scopes as clearly as most sailors could read a chart. But equipment and training meant nothing without the will to use them. That was Lee's critical contribution. He had the confidence to trust radar completely. When the battle came, when the decision had to be made, Lee was willing to shoot based on radar information alone. Most commanders in November 1942 were not. On November 14, Washington was equipped with 1 CXAM air search radar, 2 Mark III fire control radars, 4 Mark IV fire control radars, and 1 SG surface search radar. The SG was the critical piece. Microwave, 10 centimeter wavelength. Developed by Raytheon using British magnetron technology. First production sets went to sea in April 1942. Washington received hers in August. The SG could detect a battleship at 27,000 yards, a destroyer at 16,000 yards. More importantly, it displayed contacts on a planned position indicator, a circular scope that showed range and bearing simultaneously. Operators could see the entire tactical picture at a glance. Ships appeared as bright blips. Their movement was visible in real time. For the first time in naval history, a commander could see the battle developing before his ships made visual contact. Lee drilled his radar crews constantly, track contacts, identify formation patterns, maintain continuous plotting. He drilled his gunnery crews on radar-directed fire. Use radar ranging, optical bearing if possible, but be prepared to shoot on radar information alone if necessary. Trust the instruments. The radar will show you where the enemy is. Put your shells where the radar says. Most officers in 1942 did not trust radar enough to shoot at targets they could not see. Lee did. He had studied the technology. He understood the accuracy. He knew radar ranging was more precise than optical range finding at night. The Mark III could provide range accuracy within 0.1%, plus or minus 40 yards. At 10,000 yards, that meant an error of only 50 yards. Good enough. But radar was only as good as the men who operated it. Radarman Second Class Thomas Reeves was 22 years old from Minnesota. He joined the Navy in 1941, went through radar operator training in early 1942. He could read a radar scope the way a skilled mechanic could read engine sounds. Each type of return signal meant something. Large solid blip meant battleship or heavy cruiser. Medium blip meant light cruiser. Small fast moving blip meant destroyer. Blips that appeared and disappeared meant aircraft. Rain showed up as scattered returns. Land showed as a solid mass. Reeves had operated the SG aboard Washington since September 1942. He knew its quirks. The antenna mounted forward on a platform in front of the main tower. Excellent forward coverage, but it created a blind spot aft of about 80 degrees. Ships behind Washington could disappear from the scope. He knew the effective ranges, knew how weather affected performance, knew how to distinguish real contacts from false returns. On the evening of November 14, the crew of USS Washington reported to battle stations at 2200 hours. Washington and South Dakota were steaming north toward Savo Island with 4 destroyers ahead. Task Force 64 under Admiral Lee's command. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, Japanese ships were approaching Guadalcanal. At 23:30, South Dakota suffered an electrical malfunction. All circuit breakers tripped. Total power loss. Radar screens went dark. The ship went blind. Power was restored within minutes, but the SG radar remained inoperative. South Dakota was now effectively fighting without eyes. Washington was alone with functioning radar. If the Japanese made it past the destroyer screen, Washington would be the only ship that could see them coming. Shortly before midnight, Washington's radar operators saw the first contacts appear on their scopes. Small, fast-moving blips. Destroyers. They called it out. Admiral Lee's voice came over the circuit. Calm. Track them. The contacts were closing fast. They were coming straight at the task force. At 0016, Washington's 5-inch secondary batteries opened fire on the Japanese destroyer screen. Flashes lit the darkness. Shell splashes threw up columns of water. Within minutes, 3 American destroyers were hit. 2 took torpedoes. 1 was destroyed by gunfire. The Japanese destroyer screen was cutting through the American pickets. Behind the destroyers, the radar operators saw new contacts appear. Larger blips, heavier ships. They tracked them carefully. Light cruiser Sendai and 3 destroyers, moving fast from the east. Another group of contacts appeared northwest of Savo Island. 3 large blips moving south. Very large. 1 was battleship size. That was Kirishima. South Dakota, blind and trying to navigate by following Washington, inadvertently turned too close to the burning American destroyers. The flames backlit her to the Japanese ships. Every Japanese battery that could bear opened fire on her. Searchlights snapped on, 14-inch shells from Kirishima, 8-inch shells from the Giem cruisers Atago and Takao, 5-inch shells from destroyers. South Dakota took 27 hits in minutes. Fires broke out. Topside equipment was smashed. Her radar antenna was destroyed. She was hurt badly. But South Dakota's misfortune was Washington's opportunity. Every Japanese ship was focused on South Dakota. Every searchlight pointed at her, every gun trained on her. No one was looking for another battleship in the darkness. Washington, 4,000 yards behind South Dakota and to the west, moved undetected through the night. Her SG radar tracked every Japanese ship. The operators called out contacts continuously. Kirishima, bearing 310 degrees, range 12,000 yards. Closing, 11,000 yards, 10,000 yards. Lee needed to identify the target positively before opening fire. The largest radar contact could be South Dakota. Washington's SG had a blind spot to starboard aft. South Dakota had been in that blind spot. Lee had lost track of her position. The fat target on the radar screen might be the other American battleship. Shooting your own ships was not acceptable. Then, Kirishima solved the problem. She switched on her searchlights and opened fire on South Dakota. The brilliant beams cut through the darkness. There was no mistaking what she was. Kirishima, battleship, enemy, bearing 310 degrees, range 8,400 yards. Lee gave the order, open fire. At 0100 hours, Washington's 9 16-inch guns roared. 75 rounds fired in 7 minutes, tracking entirely by radar for the first 5 minutes. When the target finally became visible through optical directors, the pointer reported that radar had been exactly on target. The shells were already hitting. The first salvo landed within seconds. Probable hit. The second salvo definitely hit. Observers saw flashes on Kirishima's superstructure. The third salvo hit forward. Explosion. Fire. Washington's gunnery officer reported shells landing in a tight pattern, right on target. Fire control was tracking perfectly. Radar ranging was precise. The shells were falling exactly where the radar said the target was. Kirishima tried to turn. Too late. Washington's 16-inch armor-piercing shells weighed 2,700 pounds each. They struck at over 2,000 feet per second. Each one hit with the energy of a freight train. They punched through deck armor, bulkheads, turrets. They exploded deep inside the ship, tearing out compartments, starting fires, flooding engineering spaces. Between 9 and 20 16-inch hits, 45-inch hits. Kirishima's steering gear was wrecked. Rudders jammed hard over. She could not maneuver. Fires broke out forward and amidships. Secondary explosions followed. Her forward magazines had to be flooded. Water poured in through shell holes below the waterline. She developed a list to starboard. The list increased. Captain Iwabuchi tried everything. He attempted to beach the ship using her engines to steer. The engines would not respond. He sent divers to the steering compartments. They could not get past the jammed, watertight doors. The heat below decks was over 113 degrees Fahrenheit. The ventilation had failed. Smoke filled the lower compartments. The engine rooms had to be abandoned. Kirishima was dying. Iwabuchi knew it. The ship was rolling from side to side. Each roll was more severe than the last. The starboard list was increasing. She was going to capsize. He ordered the Emperor's portrait transferred to the destroyer Asagumo. Then he ordered abandoned ship. At 0325, on November 15, Kirishima rolled to port, capsized, and sank 7 miles northwest of Savo Island. 212 crewmen went down with her. Captain Iwabuchi and 1,098 survivors were rescued by destroyers Asagumo, Teruzuki, and Samadare. The entire engagement lasted 7 minutes. Washington fired for 7 minutes. Kirishima lasted 7 minutes. Then she was gone. The only battleship versus battleship action of the Pacific War. The first time in history a battleship had been sunk primarily by radar-directed fire. Washington emerged from the battle untouched, not one hit. The Japanese never knew she was there until she opened fire. By then it was over. Admiral Lee filed his report to Admiral Chester Nimitz on November 16. The report was precise, technical, detailed. He described the engagement, the ranges, the radar tracking, the gunnery performance. Then he added one paragraph that summarized everything. We realized then, and it should not be forgotten now, that our entire superiority was due almost entirely to our possession of radar. Certainly, we have no edge on the Japanese in experience, skill, training, or performance of personnel. Lee was not exaggerating. American radar had won the battle. Without it, Washington would have been just another ship fighting blind in the dark, just like Vincennes and Quincy and Astoria. With radar, Washington could see everything, track every ship, know their exact positions, put shells on target in total darkness from 8 miles away. It was not superior courage or superior training. It was superior technology, properly used. But here is what most people miss. Radar was not new in November 1942. The SG sets had been in service since April. Other ships had radar, but most commanders did not trust it enough to use it the way Lee did. They used radar for detection, for warning, for tracking. They did not use it for primary fire control. They were not confident enough to shoot at targets they could not see with their own eyes. Lee was different. He understood the technology. He trusted his radar operators. He trusted his instruments. He was willing to shoot based on radar information alone. That confidence, that willingness to embrace new technology completely, made the difference between victory and defeat. Word spread through the fleet immediately. Within 24 hours, every captain in the Pacific heard about Washington's victory. The battleship that fought in total darkness and destroyed an enemy battleship without taking a single hit. Officers wanted to know how it was done. How did Washington track the targets? How did she achieve such accuracy? What kind of radar did she have? How were the operators trained? Lee briefed every officer who asked. He showed them the radar plots from the battle. He explained how the SG system worked, how the plan position indicator displayed contacts, how radar ranging could be more accurate than optical range finding at night. He emphasized training. Radar operators needed constant drill. They needed to know their equipment perfectly. They needed to trust their readings. Gunnery officers needed to trust the radar operators. Some officers got it immediately. They went back to their ships and started drilling their radar crews harder. They practiced radar-directed fire. They learned to shoot at targets they could not see. Other officers remained skeptical. Radar was too new, too unfamiliar. They would use it for detection, but not for primary fire control. Not yet. But the statistics were impossible to ignore. Before November 15, 1942, Japanese forces dominated night surface combat in the Pacific. They had won at Savo Island in August. They had fought the Americans to a draw at Cape Esperance in October. They owned the darkness. After November 15, the balance shifted. American ships with functioning radar and properly trained crews began winning night engagements. The Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, 2 weeks after Washington's victory, showed both the promise and the limitations. American cruisers with radar detected a Japanese destroyer force at 23,000 yards. They tracked the enemy force as it approached. They opened fire at radar-directed ranges. First shots were accurate, then confusion set in. Radar contacts were difficult to identify. Was that blip a damaged enemy ship or a friendly ship that had turned? Captains hesitated. The Japanese launched torpedoes. 4 American cruisers were hit. 1 sank. The Americans won tactically, claimed the field, but lost more ships. The problem was not the radar. The problem was coordination. The ships had not trained together. Radar operators were not experienced enough. Officers were not confident using radar information. They hesitated at critical moments. Hesitation against the Japanese at night meant dying. The battle showed that radar alone was not enough. It required training, doctrine, coordination, confidence. The Navy learned. Commander, South Pacific Forces issued new tactical instructions in December 1942. Ships would operate in integrated task forces with standardized radar procedures. Combat information centers would coordinate information from multiple radar sets and build complete tactical pictures. Fire control officers would receive continuous radar data. Commanders would trust radar information even when optical confirmation was impossible. The changes took months to implement. New equipment had to be installed, crews had to be trained, doctrine had to be written, distributed, and drilled. But by mid-1943, the transformation was complete. American ships could fight effectively at night. The Japanese could not. The Battle of Kula Gulf in July 1943 demonstrated the change. American cruisers and destroyers intercepted a Japanese reinforcement group at night. Using radar, they detected the enemy at long range, maneuvered into firing positions, and opened fire before the Japanese knew they were there. The engagement lasted 30 minutes. The Americans sank 2 Japanese destroyers and damaged 3 others. American losses were 1 cruiser damaged. The Japanese never saw the American ships until the shells started falling. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943 was even more one-sided. American ships detected a Japanese cruiser force at 22,000 yards on radar. They tracked the enemy formation, identified ship types by size of radar return, maneuvered into optimal firing positions, and opened coordinated fire from multiple ships. The Japanese formation broke apart. They fled. American ships pursued, still tracking by radar, still firing accurately in total darkness. The Japanese lost 1 light cruiser and 1 destroyer. American ships took only minor damage. By 1944, Japanese surface forces would not fight American ships at night unless they had overwhelming numerical advantage. Even then, they often refused combat. The night belonged to the Americans. Radar had made it so. The Navy started standardizing radar equipment across the fleet. More SG sets were produced. More ships received them. By early 1943, every major combatant in the Pacific had surface search radar. Fire control radars were upgraded. The Mark 8 replaced the Mark 3. The Mark 12 and Mark 22 replaced the Mark 4. Accuracy improved, range improved, reliability improved, more importantly, training improved. Radar operators went through intensive schools. They learned to read scopes under all conditions. They learned to distinguish contacts. They learned to maintain tracking through jamming and interference. Combat information centers became standardized. Radar plot officers coordinated information from multiple radar sets. They built a complete tactical picture. They passed information to the bridge and to fire control. Officers learned to trust radar. The skepticism faded. When radar said there was a target at 15,000 yards bearing 270 degrees, officers believed it. They directed their guns accordingly. They fired. The shells hit. Success bred confidence. Confidence bred more success. By mid-1943, the Japanese could no longer safely operate surface forces at night near American-controlled waters. Their advantages in night optics and night training were neutralized. American radar could see farther and more accurately than Japanese lookouts. American ships could engage at longer ranges with better accuracy. The hunters became the hunted. Japanese officers noticed the change immediately. Combat reports from late 1942 and early 1943 mentioned American ships detecting Japanese forces at impossible ranges, opening fire in total darkness with first salvo accuracy, maintaining accurate fire through maneuvers and smoke. The reports expressed confusion. How were the Americans doing this? What had changed? Captain Iwabuchi never understood how Washington tracked Kirishima. After he was rescued and returned to Japan, he filed his own report. He described the battle from his perspective. Kirishima was engaging the American battleship ahead. Searchlights illuminated the target. Gunfire was accurate. Then suddenly shells were falling all around Kirishima from a different direction. Heavy caliber, 16-inch. Another battleship was firing. Where did it come from? Kirishima never saw it, never detected it. The shells just started landing. Within minutes, the ship was crippled. Iwabuchi's report noted no radar contacts before the engagement. Kirishima had radar, primitive compared to American sets, but functional. It showed nothing. The first indication of the second battleship was incoming 16-inch shells. By then, it was too late to maneuver or return fire effectively. Japanese naval intelligence analyzed the Kirishima loss. They examined what little data they had. They knew American ships had radar. Japanese ships had radar too, but American radar seemed qualitatively different, more accurate, longer range, better able to provide fire control data. The intelligence reports concluded American radar was at least 2 generations ahead of Japanese equipment. Japan would need to catch up. That would take years. Japan never caught up. American radar development continued accelerating through the war. By 1944, American ships had multiple overlapping radar systems. Air search, surface search, fire control, identification of friend or foe, all integrated through combat information centers. Officers could see threats before they developed. They could coordinate responses. They could mass fires. They could fight effectively at night, in weather, through smoke. The Japanese fell further behind. Their radar development was slower. Production was limited. Integration with fire control systems was poor. Training was inadequate. By 1945, Japanese surface forces avoided night combat whenever possible. The darkness that had been their ally in 1942 had become their enemy. Admiral Willis Lee received the Navy Cross for his actions at Guadalcanal. He was promoted to vice admiral in March 1944 and given command of all fast battleships in the Pacific Fleet. He became Commander Battleships Pacific Fleet. He spent the next year developing tactics for battleship operations, integrating new technologies, preparing the fleet for the final push against Japan. Lee never fought another surface action. The opportunity never came. After Guadalcanal, Japanese battleships rarely ventured within range of American forces. The few times they did, air power sank them before surface forces could engage. Lee's expertise was in gunnery and night combat. By 1944, the war had moved beyond surface gunnery. It was a carrier war, an air war. Lee adapted. He developed anti-aircraft tactics. He worked on defenses against kamikaze attacks. On August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan surrendered, Lee suffered a heart attack. He collapsed in a motor launch, ferrying him to his flagship USS Wyoming in Portland, Maine. He died before reaching the ship. He was 57 years old. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His obituary mentioned his Olympic medals, his combat record, his service at Guadalcanal. It did not mention that he was the first admiral to command a battleship engagement using primarily radar-directed fire. That fact was still classified. The radar operators who tracked Kirishima that night remained largely anonymous. Their names do not appear in the official action reports. They were radiomen, fire controlmen, and electricians' mates trained in the new radar equipment. The Navy would not create the formal radar man rating until 1943. These men operated equipment most officers barely understood. They translated green blips on glowing screens into the firing solutions that won the battle. Without them, Admiral Lee's faith in radar would have meant nothing. In 1992, oceanographer Robert Ballard discovered Kirishima's wreck during an expedition to map the battle sites of Guadalcanal. The ship lay upside down in 3,500 feet of water. Her bow section was missing from the bridge forward, blown off by a magazine explosion. Her anchor chain was wrapped around her stern. The wreck was a tomb for 212 sailors who never escaped. Ballard's team examined the damage. Multiple large caliber shell hits were visible even after 50 years underwater. The concentration of hits on the steering gear and engineering spaces showed precision fire. Washington's gunners had not just hit Kirishima, they had systematically destroyed critical systems. That level of accuracy in total darkness was unprecedented. Only radar-directed fire could achieve it. Captain Sanji Iwabuchi never got another ship command. He was reassigned to staff duty after Kirishima sank. He spent most of 1943 in training and administrative positions. In late 1944, he was given command of the Manila Naval Defense Force in the Philippines. When American forces invaded Luzon in early 1945, Iwabuchi refused orders to evacuate Manila. He fortified the city and fought to the death. Over 16,000 Japanese sailors died. 100,000 Filipino civilians died. Iwabuchi was killed in the fighting, probably by suicide on February 26, 1945. He was deeply shamed by the loss of Kirishima. He saw Manila as his chance to restore his honor. Instead, he committed atrocities and died a war criminal. The survivors of the Battle of Savo Island never forgot what happened in August 1942. For decades, they held reunions, shared stories, remembered the men who did not come back. Many carried guilt. Why did I survive when my shipmates died? The answer was luck, random chance. Some men were in compartments that flooded slowly. Some were topside when the torpedoes hit. Some were blown clear by explosions. There was no pattern, just luck. But one thing all the survivors agreed on was this. If their ships had possessed radar like Washington's, if their commanders had been trained to use it properly, they might have survived. They might have seen the Japanese ships coming. They might have opened fire first, at longer range, with accurate gunnery. They might have won, instead of dying in the dark. USS Washington served through the entire war. After Guadalcanal, she became the flagship of the fast battleship force in the Pacific. She screened aircraft carriers during the Marshall Islands campaign in January and February 1944. She bombarded Japanese positions on Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Her 16-inch guns destroyed shore batteries, supply dumps, and defensive positions. She provided anti-aircraft protection for the carrier task forces. In February 1944, Washington collided with the battleship USS Indiana during night maneuvers off the Marshall Islands. The collision damaged Washington's bow. She went to Pearl Harbor for repairs and returned to action in April. She participated in the Mariana Islands campaign, screening carriers during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. She bombarded Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Her guns supported the Marine landings. In October 1944, Washington was part of Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The fast battleships were assigned to screen the carriers against Japanese surface attack. When Admiral Halsey took the battleships north to chase a Japanese carrier force, Lee's battleship division was left out of the only surface action at Surigao Strait. Lee's battleships could have participated in the night surface battle, but they were 200 miles away, steaming north. Lee later said it was one of the great disappointments of his career. He commanded the most powerful battleship force in the world, and he never got another chance to use them in surface combat. Washington fought at Iwo Jima in February 1945. She bombarded the island for 3 days before the Marine landing. Her guns destroyed pillboxes, bunkers, and defensive positions. She provided fire support during the battle. At Okinawa, in April 1945, Washington faced the kamikazes. Japanese suicide aircraft attacked the fleet repeatedly. Washington's anti-aircraft guns shot down multiple aircraft. Her radar-directed fire control proved effective against air targets as well as surface targets. She was never hit. Washington was present in Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945. She anchored near the battleship USS Missouri, where the Japanese signed the surrender documents. The war had lasted 3 years, 8 months, and 26 days since Pearl Harbor. Washington had fought through most of it. After the war, Washington served in the Atlantic Fleet until 1947, when she was placed in reserve. She was struck from the Naval Register in 1960 and sold for scrap in 1961. Her SG radar antenna, the device that allowed her to see in the dark and sink Kirishima, was removed during a refit in 1943. It was replaced by more advanced equipment. No one kept it. No one thought it was historically significant. The men who had operated that radar, who had tracked Kirishima in the darkness, went home and returned to civilian life. Most never told their families what they had done. They were radar operators. Nobody understood what that meant. Nobody asked. The strategic impact of the radar revolution extended far beyond individual battles. American radar gave the United States Navy complete control of the electromagnetic spectrum at sea. This affected every aspect of naval operations. Air defense improved dramatically. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire was far more effective than visual tracking. Carriers could detect incoming air attacks at greater distances. Fighter directors could vector defensive fighters precisely onto incoming raids. Japanese aircraft losses increased. American carrier losses decreased. Navigation became more precise. Radar could fix positions by measuring distances to known landmarks. Ships could navigate safely in restricted waters at night. Convoys could maintain formation in darkness and poor weather. The logistical advantage was enormous. American ships could operate around the clock. Japanese ships were increasingly limited to daytime operations when they could see. Submarine warfare changed. American submarines equipped with radar could track convoys at night from beyond visual range. They could approach on the surface, attack, and escape before the escorts could respond. Japanese anti-submarine tactics became less effective. Their escorts relied primarily on visual detection and sound ranging. Against radar-equipped submarines operating on the surface at night, these methods failed. By 1945, American radar had evolved into integrated combat management systems. The Combat Information Center became the nerve center of the ship. Radar data from multiple sources fed into the CIC. Operators plotted contacts, identified friend or foe, calculated firing solutions, and coordinated defensive measures. The captain received a complete tactical picture instantly. Decisions could be made faster and based on better information. The advantage was overwhelming. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has a display on the naval battles of Guadalcanal. It includes photographs of Washington, South Dakota, and Kirishima. It describes the action on November 14 through 15, 1942. It mentions radar played a role, but the display does not show what it looked like to fight that battle. It does not show radar operators standing in the darkened Combat Information Center, watching green blips move across their scopes, calling out ranges and bearings while 16-inch guns roared overhead. It does not show Admiral Lee making the decision to trust his radar completely and shoot at targets he could not see. It does not show the 7 minutes that changed naval warfare forever. That is how technology really changes war. Not through grand announcements or official programs, but through men like Willis Lee who understand new capabilities and have the courage to use them fully. Through radar operators who master complex equipment and operate it perfectly under pressure. Through organizations that learn from defeat, adapt quickly, and embrace change, even when it contradicts everything they thought they knew. The Navy that lost 4 cruisers at Savo Island in August 1942 was a Navy still learning to fight at night. The Navy that sank Kirishima in November 1942 was a Navy that had learned. The difference was 3 months, 16 sunken warships, thousands of dead sailors, and the realization that whoever controlled the electromagnetic spectrum would control the night. American radar gave them that control. They never gave it back. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.